Well, welcome. So you're here for another episode of Conservative Conversations with ISI. This is our webinar program where we hold interviews with various conservatives from all sorts of backgrounds. It's great to see all these many names. I can't see any faces, but it's great to see so many people and so much interest. And I'm here with, the legendary Dr. George, who I'm really excited to introduce. Dr. George, I hate to do this. I'm embarrassed, but we introduce people here with memes, as you may have seen before. So this is what we're going with for you. Let's see if it opens. Okay. All right, so it's you playing the banjo, and it says, "Anyway, here's Wonderwall." So that's your meme. If anyone has any better ideas for memes for Robbie George that we should have done, please drop them in the chat. In the meantime, Dr. George, you're the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program of American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. You're also frequently a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. And our viewers that want a more thorough bio of you can go look on our website to learn more. But let's sort of cut to the chase and get into the interview, and I'll remove this terrible meme for a second. Okay, so we're here to talk about the common good, and more importantly, what that means now, what that means in today's political environment. So I guess I'll just start by asking for just a definition from you. What do we mean when we say common good, and what is kind of common good conservatism? What's this term that's being thrown around these days?
Any association or organization of any type has a common good. The good consists of the goods for the sake of which people have reason to organize or to get together, to cooperate, making everyone in the community better off. At least that's what they think, by working together in common to achieve these goods. Now, ordinarily, when we speak of the common good, we're talking about the common good of a political community. But we need to remember that, again, any association, organization, or business or institution will have a common good, the set of goods that give people reason to collaborate, to cooperate. A clothing store, a couple of partners form a clothing store to sell clothes, make a profit. They've got a common good, common enterprise. A university has a common good. People are united to pursue knowledge, to teach students, and so forth. So what is the common good of the political community? Well, it's the goods for the sake of which we have reason to cooperate with each other as citizens. And that's a very wide range of goods. At the core or foundation are the goods that are things that are worthwhile for their own sakes and not simply as means to other ends. That's at the foundation. Mm-hmm. But we, of course, also have reason to collaborate with respect to instrumental goods. A very important one of those is the good of liberty, the good that enables us to pursue things whose value is not merely instrumental, but is intrinsic. Mm-hmm. The good of friendship, the good of pursuing intellectual knowledge, the good of achieving justice, the good of virtue, and so forth. So the common good of the political society is sometimes summed up in our particular tradition as the interest that we have in forming a government, a system of laws to advance public health, safety, and morals. That's the traditional tripartite formulation. But it's not meant to be comprehensive. Ordinarily, the phrase "and advance the general welfare" or "advance the common good" is added. Mm-hmm. Now, stated just that way, one might leap to the wrong conclusion, the incorrect conclusion, that the common good of the political community is unlimited. But that's not true. Among the things that are for the common good is limited government. Not only for the sake, as our libertarian friends rightly remind us, of individual liberty. That's where libertarians tend to focus, and that's true. We need the government to be limited, in part they stress, for the sake of protecting individual liberty. But we conservatives also recognize that the political order, government, law, needs to be limited for the sake of preserving the autonomy, the authority, and the integrity of the institutions of civil society, what Burke called the little platoons, beginning with the family and religious associations and neighborhood associations and all the institutions, the voluntary associations that have the primary responsibility to protect public health, safety, and morals, to protect public health, education, and welfare, to transmit to each new generation the values and the virtues that enable people to lead successful lives and be good citizens. The state goes wrong. It violates the common good when, even if in the name of the common good, it oversteps those limited bounds and usurps the authority of the family, the church, the neighborhood association, the private association. So for the tradition of common good thinking with which I myself am associated and which has so profoundly shaped the conservative sensibility on these issues, for this tradition, limited government is government that plays a subsidiary role, not the primary role, the subsidiary role. That gives us what's called the doctrine of subsidiarity, which is central to the conservative understanding of the common good. That doctrine says when power needs to be exercised, as often it will be, when authority has to be exercised, it should be exercised as close to the people over whom it is exercised, giving them as much control as possible over it, so that it actually serves their interest and doesn't tyrannize them. So what the individual can do, the doctrine of subsidiarity says, let the individual do. If you can do it by individual initiative, then let it be done by individual initiative. Of course, the family is there because there are lots of things that we don't do as individuals or don't do well as individuals, but we do perfectly well as families. We don't need the government interfering in that. Thank you. The family can do it. Now, sometimes the family alone can't achieve the goods for the sake of which we have reason to collaborate in broader communities, religious ones or secular ones. It could be the church or the synagogue. It could be the Boy Scouts. It could be Little League. It could be 4-H. It could be an association that enables us to pool our resources to provide music lessons for kids in our community, or a library or something like that. But where this can be done without government intervention, where private associations can do it and do it well, let it be done by them. The government violates the common good when it steps in, usurps the authority of the private sphere, and imposes. But of course, there are some things, quite a few things, that can't be done well or right, or some cases at all, by private initiative. And that's why we have government, and having government is for the common good. I'll tell you what's contrary to the common good, something we've had reason to think about a lot in the past few days. Something contrary to the common good is anarchy. That's in nobody's interest. In fact, it's for the common good that we avoid anarchy. We organize not only private associations with their proper authority and respect, but also government. But where government is proper and may properly exercise authority and intervene, it should be the level of government closest to the people, so that tyranny can be avoided, so that the people have some control, so that people can influence better what government does. It's, after all, their interests that gives government any authority at all in the area. So if it can be done by local government, for heaven's sake, let the local government do it. Don't move things up to the provincial or state or regional government. But if it's something that can't be accomplished or accomplished well by the local government, then yes, by all means, then it's legitimate to move it up to the state level. If it can't be resolved or done well at the state level, that gives us legitimate reason for it to be handled at a national level, what we sometimes call the central government. Now, that's all very theoretical, political theoretical. I think it all makes sense. It's basically the conservative story. It's rooted not only in the common law tradition and the thinking of people like Burke, but also the thinking of the great medieval thinkers like Aristotle, like Aquinas, the great ancient thinkers like Aristotle. It's for the common good that there be a rule of law. It's for the common good, we believe. This one was not something endorsed so much by the ancients or the medievals in republican government. We think that's for the common good and helps to make it the case that the people are not tyrannized, that people are in control of the institutions that govern them. So that's all political theoretical. We also have a specific constitutional system in our country by which we seek to preserve the common good, including the common good in individual liberty. Libertarians are right to stress that. And also, something libertarians tend not to stress so much, the autonomy and authority and integrity of the institutions of civil society. We have a constitution that serves the common good by limiting power, by checking and balancing. So first of all, our founding fathers judged that it was for the overall common good, the general welfare, that the national government not be a government of general jurisdiction with plenary authority. The federal government is not what we call the federal government. The central government, Washington, D.C., has no authority, no plenary authority to do whatever is in the common interest, whatever is for the common good. No, that national government, under our Constitution, is a government of delegated and enumerated and therefore limited powers. The general jurisdiction, our founders had a very creative idea about. Don't vest it in the central government as they did in England, as they did in France. That's too great a risk of tyranny. Vest it rather in states, nearer the people, where the people have more control. So while our national government is a government of delegated and enumerated powers, and therefore limited powers, our state governments are governments of general jurisdiction with the what we call police powers to protect public health, safety, and morals and advance the common good. Mm. But even the states, though their powers are plenary, have an obligation not only to respect individual rights, and there are some specific things put out of bounds to them by the federal constitution. There are more things put out of bounds to them by their own state constitutions, but the states have an obligation to respect what we call, our founders didn't know this concept. They had the basic idea, but they didn't know the word, the idea of subsidiarity. States too, and municipal governments, local governments, have an obligation to respect the autonomy and the authority and the integrity of the institutions of civil society. So when you hear crazy talk, like we should abolish homeschooling, or we should abolish private schools or private religious schools, there's a classic case. This is a sort of strong socialist impact. Not all socialists believe this, but too many socialists. I don't like socialism generally, but I especially don't like socialists who think that familial authority is what's derivative and secondary, and government authority is what's primary. So the kids actually belong not to families, but to the state. And just as a convenient way of operating, the states allow families to make decisions about their children's upbringing and education, because after all, that's the best way to get the kids fed and diapered. And then when they grow up enough, off to school and so forth and so on. That's completely wrong. Kids belong fundamentally to families. We're born into families. Our natural human bonds are with families. Families are natural in ways that government is not. So the strong socialist impulse to treat the state as primary and the institutions of civil society as derivative and having their power on sufferance from the state is completely wrong. The conservative idea, on the other hand, is right. And that is the fundamental institutions of civil society that have primary responsibility. We give over some power to government at various levels when and only when it's necessary for government to do things because they can't be done or done well by private initiative, by voluntary associations, and so forth. But even then, subsidiarity structures things. The lowest level of government, closest to the people, should do what it can. We only kick things up to higher associations, ultimately the central government, when necessary to do that.
Okay. Wow. So a lot to unpack there. It's a great schema to work with. We want to quickly remind the audience, or tell the audience, if you have questions for Dr. George, I'll do Q&A at the end of this interview. So leave them on the questions tab that you'll see next to the chat tab. So if you leave a question where it says Q&A, I'll answer that at the end. So just want to build off of something that you were saying about individual rights, and let me hit you with a couple critiques that I've heard from the right about the common good. So on the one hand, you have kind of individualist conservatives who say, maybe it's something like, I care a lot about the common good, but the government doesn't do anything right. Why do I want the government to have a say in the common good? And then on the other hand, there are some conservatives that say that maybe the common good, you want to go even further than you, and say something along the lines of someone like Adrian Vermeule, for example, had an article recently on common good conservatism where he sort of claimed that natural law of the Constitution has to rely on the idea that the founders had natural law right. So are there some conservatives that don't take the common good too far? And are there some conservatives that don't take it far enough? And how would you respond to them?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the second point so well. You may have to come back to that with me, the one that you attributed to Adrian. Professor Vermeule, my friend with whom I taught at Harvard Law School. So we can come back to that. But on the first one, I think I can address that directly. There is a view that says, it's a kind of extreme libertarian view, that really what matters at the end is individual rights, and government exists to protect individual rights and only to protect individual rights. Sometimes this is even further radicalized. Among the institutions that are threats to individual rights are institutions like families and churches and voluntary associations, which are potential oppressors. Here's sometimes where the extreme right and the extreme left meet. It's a critique very similar to the radical socialist critique. So we have to protect the individual from the government. The individual from, say, the family, which becomes oppressive, or the religious community that becomes oppressive. This, I think, is gravely mistaken all the way through. There are good reasons to have government. We don't want anarchy. And in addition to the protection of individual rights, government has a role to play in protecting public health, safety, and morals. Our founding fathers understood this perfectly well. They created a system where that could be done. The main responsibility remaining lower levels of government, state and local government, not with the national government. I think that made and makes perfect sense. Of course, our national government has, regrettably, crashed through the limits on its authority. But I think we conservatives should never give up on trying to get the federal government back in its lane, and to try to restore the right balance, the correct, constitutionally correct, and originally understood balance between the national governments and the states, and between government and civil society. I think we need to avoid the view that holds that the common good is in itself a threat to individual rights. So anytime we hear an appeal to the common good, we should reach for our wallets or reach for our revolvers because someone's going to either steal something from us or assault us, and we should have the narrow libertarian utopian style of government that only protects people against violence and fraud, maybe fraud, violence, maybe fraud, and that's it. That's too narrow and restricted a view. But there is nevertheless truth in the fundamental libertarian insight. It's not that libertarianism is just plain wrong from a conservative point of view. There's room within conservatism. It's necessary within conservatism for us to care about individual rights. We need to be with the libertarians on that. We don't take a radical view of it. We're down the line with them on freedom of speech, freedom of the press, certainly freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, right to self-protection, and our Constitution, the right to bear arms, due process, equal protection. We conservatives need to be the very best of civil libertarians, but we don't need to and shouldn't embrace so limited a role for government that we perceive any appeal to the common good as something that is in itself contrary to individual rights. Now, having said that, just one more point, having said that, let's also remember that the people who will violate our rights and the people who will usurp the authority of institutions of civil society will always claim to be doing it for the sake of the common good. So we need to be vigilant to make sure that the concept of the common good is not being used by ideologues, especially those of the left, who invoke this all the time, to claim an unwarranted authority to roll over the individual, or roll over the family, or roll over the church, roll over civil society. That's a corrupt understanding of the common good. So if somebody says, "Oh, we need a national socialized healthcare system because the common good requires it," don't you believe in the common good? Mm-hmm. Well, don't fall for that nonsense. We want to know how this is going to make things better. We want to know and need to demand to know, how will individual rights and the authority of families be respected in such a system? Why can't it be done without or with less government involvement? Since we want the minimum amount of government involvement necessary precisely in order to protect individual freedom and the autonomy and authority and integrity of the institutions of civil society. You see, you can make the mistake either way with corrupt, misguided conceptions of the common good, seeing the common good as only the enemy, or letting people invoke the common good to ride roughshod over what the common good actually is supposed to protect. I should add one more point there, actually, Thomas. Mm-hmm. Never let anybody trick you into believing, as my great teacher, Ronald Dworkin, tried to sell. He had this theory. I utterly reject it. I think it's a trick. That what rights are, individual rights, civil liberties, are checks on or trumps against, to use Dworkin's term, trumps on the common good. Mm-hmm. So there's common good, we should pursue it, but then when individual rights come in, they're trumps on the common good. This sets up an antipathy between the common good and individual liberty or individual rights, which is just false to the moral facts. The reality is we should protect rights because rights are for the common good. It's for the common good that we protect everybody's rights, because the rights themselves exist not as abstractions just falling down like rain from the heavens. The rights exist to protect human goods. Your right to free speech exists to protect the goods that are protected by free speech. Truth-seeking, fair communication. These are important goods. The right to freedom of religion exists to protect the rights associated with the pursuit of truth about ultimate things, with the desire to live, the honorable and necessary desire to live with authenticity and integrity in light of one's best judgment about the truth of the ultimate questions of meaning and value and so forth. So our rights protect goods, and the protection of those rights, and therefore those goods, is itself an aspect of the common good. It is for the common good that we have a First Amendment. Or at least it doesn't have to call it, you don't have to call it a First Amendment. That's unique to the historical circumstances of our political system. But it is for the common good that any political system protect freedom of speech, protect freedom of religion, protect freedom of assembly, protect freedom of the press, and so forth. Now, are there limits to those rights? Yes. And again, it's for the common good that there be limits. We could talk, for example, about what you do in a pandemic. The right to freedom of assembly has got to be, to some extent, constrained during a pandemic. Conscription during a war. The right to go about your ordinary business if you're a healthy 20-year-old male and, the nation's invaded, unless you're a radical libertarian who rejects the whole idea that conscription can be valid, treats it as a form of slavery. Most people think that can be a legitimate constraint on a liberty that would otherwise exist because of the necessity, for the sake of the common good, of us protecting this precious experiment in ordered liberty and protecting the people of our nation against oppression and tyranny.
Right. I'll clarify my sort of Adrian Vermeule point, although we don't have to dwell on it much. But he says, talking about natural rights originalism, that approach leaves originalism in ultimate control, hoping the original understanding will happen to be morally appealing. I wonder if you think it, if we appeal to the founders for what we call the common good, does that put originalism in the driver's seat too much?
I think it's for the common good that there be law, and it's for the common good that officials who have as their mission enforcing the law or applying the law do so faithfully. So sheriffs and presidents and judges, because they are not legislators, they are enforcers and appliers of laws they do not make, should faithfully enforce and apply the law. They shouldn't rewrite the laws. Justice Gorsuch recently did that in the Bostock case, which was a terrible thing. I was very surprised that my old dear friend, Justice Gorsuch, Neil Gorsuch, that he made that error. I'm sure he was in good faith, but it was a terrible error. And in effect, he rewrote the laws. That's where they go wrong. It's where judges go wrong, or presidents go wrong, or other law enforcement or executive officers go wrong sometimes, when instead of enforcing or applying the law as written, they rewrite it. It's not for the common good that they do that. They're stepping out of their lanes. They're stepping out of bounds. It's for the common good that they do their jobs and stay in their lanes and apply the law as written. Now, it might be that the law is mistaken. It might be that the law is unjust. We have a history in this country, as they do in all nations, of unjust laws. Our laws are never going to be perfect. There are unjust laws today, some terrible ones. I believe the laws regarding abortion are gravely unjust, violations of human rights. But we change the laws, we work to change the laws through the constitutionally prescribed means. That, too, is for the common good. We don't change the laws by violence and taking the law into our own hands and things like that. So I don't think Adrian would disagree with this. The judges should faithfully apply the law. Now, whether we should, as interpreters of the Constitution, use the theory of originalism as the correct or exclusively correct theory of interpretation, that's something that is debated. Conservatives have rallied around that idea in constitutional interpretation. My own view generally of legal interpretation, including constitutional interpretation, is that the interpreter, let's say the judge, should be guided by the text in its plain meaning. Or if the meaning is not plain, it's certainly legitimate to look at the logic of the text, the structure of the text and the structure of the law or the institutions created by the legal provisions, say the system of federalism under our national constitution, and the historical understanding, the original understanding. So I think original understanding has a role to play, but not exclusively.
Right.
What opposed to is so-called living constitutionalism, or any theory that permits the judge or other interpreter to cross the line into becoming a legislator. Mm-hmm. Judges should not be legislators. Certainly under our system, they shouldn't. And so I don't want judges rewriting law. I don't want people doing what they did in the judges did in Roe versus Wade, or Planned Parenthood against Casey, or what Justice Gorsuch did in the Bostock and other Title VII cases. You can think of hundreds of terrible examples of the judicial usurpation of legislative authority. That's not for the common good. final point on this, the founders could be wrong about certain things. Certainly were wrong about certain things. Certainly were wrong about slavery.
Right.
Many of our founders, not all. Some were anti-slave. But, where they're wrong, you correct it by the constitutionally prescribed means. You don't pretend that the law is something that it's not. You don't interpret the law out of existence. You don't say, oh, we got a living constitution. It's up to judges to make up new law, or it's up to presidents by executive orders to make up new law. That's not for the common good. That's lawlessness. And lawlessness is never for the common good, not in a basically just regime.
Right. Well, so
I'm in a regime that it would be wrong to subvert.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that brings up an interesting question. So you're talking about how, interpreting, the judge's role in interpreting the law. We've had some interesting court cases recently. You brought up the Gorsuch decision, the Title VII case. The next day we had a decision from Justice Roberts on abortion. So do you think that these judges today are playing a political game, or is it that are these rulings in accordance to their conscience?
I know both Justice Gorsuch and Chief Justice Roberts. I know Justice Gorsuch a bit better than I know Chief Justice Roberts. I like them both. I have had very nice, good relationships. I've worked a bit with Justice Gorsuch. His book was published in the series at Princeton University Princeton University Press, of which I'm a series editor, and he's contributed an essay to a volume I edited, and he's been here as my guest, and I've been at the Supreme Court with my students as his guest, and so forth. So we know each other pretty well. Justice Roberts, I know from visits to the court, and he kindly swore me in when I assumed the chairmanship of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. It was a wonderful occasion. He swore me in. I was holding Harriet Tubman's Bible. I wasn't holding it, actually. Cornel West was holding Harriet Tubman's Bible, and I had my hand on Harriet Tubman's Bible for the swearing in. I don't want to think anything but well of these two men, but I am perplexed and distraught, really. I'm going to be honest. I'm distraught by the rulings in the two cases that you mentioned. The Bostock case, Justice Gorsuch somehow bought a sophistical so-called textualist argument that was just utterly untenable. The logic of it would lead to ridiculous consequences. I have no idea how he fell into that, or why he was not persuaded by Justice Alito's overwhelmingly, to my mind, persuasive dissent. That should have been the majority opinion, and Justice Gorsuch should have joined it. Justice Roberts on the Louisiana abortion decision, in which he joined the four liberal justices who don't really care all that much about what the Constitution says. They have the living Constitution idea. They think it's the role of the judge to use the Constitution or constitutional cases to advance the progressive agenda by whatever means necessary. But why Justice Roberts joined them in upholding a law that he knew was unconstitutional. Upholding a law that he knew, joined them in striking down a law that he knew was constitutionally legitimate. His having said so about a similar law in Texas only a couple of years earlier is making clear that he hadn't changed his mind about that, nor should he. He was absolutely right in the Texas case from a couple of years ago. But deciding to join the four liberals to strike down this constitutionally perfectly legitimate law on the theory that stare decisis, the bindingness of precedent, requires that outcome. That makes no sense. The Supreme Court has countless times, hundreds of times, reversed itself, not been bound by stare decisis when it was wrong, especially when an opinion is not of longstanding, has not been accepted by the American public, has not been integrated into the life of the people, and is not now uncontroversial. Sometimes it's probably true. Clarence Thomas is still a holdout against this, but sometimes it's probably true, as Justice Scalia taught, that you just have to treat a bad precedent, a wrongly decided precedent as binding. But that's only when certain criteria have been met. It's no longer controversial. It's been fully accepted by the people. Its application does not damage legal interpretation or the law further. It's kind of locked in. It's hermetically sealed. Sometimes it's probably true that you do have to do that. This was not such a case, not by any means, nor is Roe against Wade. Roe should have been reversed in this case. In fact, Roe should be reversed immediately. We're 40 plus years way overdue for the reversing of a decision that is not only responsible for grave human rights abuses and injustices, but it's just constitutionally, utterly implausible, untenable, crazy. There is no constitutional basis for the idea of a right to abortion. None, zero, zip. This is completely manufactured and it's indefensible. And here it's hard for me to think of how any honest interpreter could say otherwise. They might like it. They might be for the policy it creates. This one is it's a no-hoper.
Okay. Well, I have to ask you, since you're a professor at Princeton, about the changing of the name of the Woodrow Wilson School. I'm not a huge fan of Woodrow Wilson. You might not be either. But I wonder if how you feel about this, and if you think Princeton has a schema for how they know what should and should not be canceled. And are you worried about this leading to sort of other negative impacts?
Yes, I am. I'm wary of iconoclasm. I think all conservatives and all sensible people are worried about iconoclasm. It always gets out of control. I was surprised by the decision. Careful deliberation had been given to this issue 4 years ago by our university, and the decision was made and defended, I think, quite well to retain the name of the Wilson School. You're right. Woodrow Wilson may be my least favorite president. He's certainly one of my 5 least favorite presidents. He's up there with Buchanan. He was in many ways a bad man. He was a racist, no question about that. He was a terrible racist. So I hold against him that racism in the same way that my woke colleagues and our woke students hold that against him. But I hold a lot of things against him that they rather like about him. I hold against him that he was a founding father and aggressive pusher of the progressive movement. I hold against him that he built the administrative state. I hold against him that he violated civil liberties quite brutally during the First World War. I hold against him that he despised the Madisonian constitutional system. He famously said when he was occupying the chair I now hold in Princeton, I've gotten my revenge by getting his chair, you see. But when he was the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence, he taught that our Constitution needs to be abandoned because it establishes a, quote, Newtonian system that is unfit for a Darwinian age. Couldn't have been more wrong about that. He was an enemy of the Constitution, enemy of the Declaration of Independence. So I have a lot of things to hold against him. On the other hand, the League of Nations, another thing, right? His utopian vision of a world government. People on the left love that. But they have a lot to like about him. I don't like what they don't like about him, but I don't like a bunch of other stuff that they like about him. But he built Princeton University into a university. Now, small college, I went to Swarthmore. I love small colleges. I think small liberal arts colleges are great, but I think they're different from research universities, and I'm glad Princeton is a research university. Had it not been for Woodrow Wilson, we'd probably be a good small college like, say, Bucknell or Sinus or something like that. We are a world-class, famous, big, important research university because Woodrow Wilson decided he was going to make Princeton University into such a thing. And it was really for that he was honored by having a college named for him at Princeton, which name has now been taken off, and the School of Public Affairs named for him. Of course, on that one, those who were responsible for naming the school after him were not only proud of him because he had built the university into a true university, but also because they liked the League of Nations and the administrative state and all that other stuff that I don't like. this stripping away, this iconoclasm, is bad and it's dangerous, and there's not a stopping point for it, because it embraces a kind of ideology that we've come to know as presentism, the idea that we're to judge people by the standards of the present, and particularly by the standards of those who regard themselves as the most advanced or woke of the present. But if you embrace presentism and start, tearing down every statue, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and not just Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, Christopher Columbus, Junipero Serra, the Catholic saint who had the missions in California. When you start doing that, when you embrace presentism, you place yourself in perpetual war. You are in perpetual war with your own past. And you cannot recognize or honor anybody or anything in your past for the good that was done. All you see is the bad aspects of the person. So, you tear down the statue of Washington because he held slaves. You give no credit to the fact that he was the indispensable man without whom there would have been no republic that at great cost of blood and treasure finally abolished slavery. Right. What about Martin Luther King? We have a beautiful statue to him in Washington, D.C., which we should have. He was a great man. He taught the lesson as well or better than anyone has of the universal brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, a critical principle at a time when we needed it because of the legacy of slavery and segregation. Helped to undo the terrible Jim Crow system. Here's a man who deserves to be honored, but we now know he abused women. David Garrow, as left a guy as you can get, famous historian and biographer, is convinced that he actually was present in a hotel room where a woman was assaulted and laughed at the assault. Now, do we tear down the statue? I don't like that about King. I don't like the way he treated women. I'm appalled and shocked and horrified at the possibility that he laughed while a woman was being raped or sexually assaulted. And yet, I know we don't have that statue of King in Washington, D.C. to honor him for abusing women. We have it to honor him for his role in calling us to live up to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, the inherent dignity in each and every member of the human family. We're all sinners. We all fall short. There's nobody perfect. We all have bad histories in some respect or another. But people deserve to be honored for the good that they do when they have done good that has contributed importantly to the institutions or to the nation. And I think that's what we're now about to abandon.
Right. No, that was a great answer. And it's time to move to the Q&A. Before we do, I'm going to read a quick note from our sponsor, which is, of course, ISI. Are you tired of the progressive orthodoxy on campus? Eager to go beyond the narrow range of debate in the classroom? Learn the timeless principles of liberty so that you can pursue truth and freedom. ISI introduces students to the American tradition of liberty and to a vibrant community of students and scholars. Our members get an education and a community that they don't find at their universities. And in the process, they become articulate voices for conservative principles. To get the college education you deserve, become a member today at join.isi.org. So first question comes from our ISI student, actually from Princeton, Akil. And he asks, to what extent, if at all, is common good conservatism jeopardized by conservatives placing too much faith in the federal judiciary to secure their interests? It seems particularly relevant given the court's decisions this term and the Trump administration's emphasis on judicial nominations.
I mentioned earlier one of my teachers, Ronald Dworkin, the great Oxford legal philosopher who died a few years ago. I actually didn't have him at Oxford. I sat in on some seminars with him there, but I had him as a teacher at Harvard. He was a visiting professor when I was at the law school. Famously, and he's a big liberal and advocate of judicial, what we have come to call judicial activism. He had a theory of constitutional interpretation, which he called the moral reading of the Constitution, the point of which was to somehow try to justify judges bringing their progressive moral visions to bear in resolving cases, expanding, as he understood it, expanding rights and so forth. I've been very critical of all that. But in his most important book, I think most important book at all, but certainly his most important book in legal philosophy, philosophy of law, which is entitled Law's Empire, he says that in Law's Empire, the courts are the capitals and the judges are the princes. I think the lesson of 200 plus years of judicial review, the lessons of 200 years of judicial activism, which seems never to go away, is that if judges are princes, then the wisdom of the Bible has been fully vindicated when it says, place not thy trust in princes. They're going to let you down. Mm-hmm. They will not rule wisely and justly. I place more faith in the people operating through the constitutionally prescribed institutions of Republican democracy than I do in courts. At the same time, I think that courts do have an important role to play, but they need to stay in their lanes, just like presidents need to stay in their lanes and Congress needs to stay in its lane. But within that just authority, that constitutionally prescribed domain of authority, courts should play their role. So when Wilson was abusing his authority during the First World War and persecuting socialists who have the same rights as the rest of us, should be protected as much as anybody else. When he was abusing their First Amendment rights, courts should have stopped that. Courts should have slapped down the president. So courts have a role to play, an important role to play. Courts have an important role to play in protecting religious freedom. Courts have a role to play in ensuring that the executive doesn't trespass too far on the rights of the legislative branch. There are important things for courts to do, which is why we need good judges. We need the best possible judges. Mm-hmm. But if we think, and I think this is Akil's point, if we think that we can lose or give up the legislative and executive branch and be preserved in our basic liberties, or that the common good can be preserved by the courts, not going to happen, folks. That's not enough.
Right.
That's not enough. And we shouldn't want it to be enough. We shouldn't want our courts to behave in the way progressives want the courts to behave in their causes, because we should be the people protecting the founders' vision of Republican government. Republican government isn't government by the judges. Republican government is government of, by, and for the people. Now, all government is government of the people. All good government is government for the people. Even the governance of a benign monarch or a benign despot is for the people. What's distinctive about Republican government is that it's government by the people. The people aren't the judges. We don't elect them. They're not accountable to us. We can't remove them. We as the people govern ourselves via the legislative houses, our state legislatures and our Congress. And there's where the fundamental work has to be done to influence things for the common good. We should be working diligently to get a better Senate and to get back the House and get a better House. Yes, we need to worry about the courts. We need the best possible judges. And boy, our side has done a lousy job at making sure that our judges are true constitutionalists, faithful interpreters of the law. But, we got to do better, but let's not place our trust in those princes.
Okay. Moving, away from the courts a little bit. This is from former ISI honor scholar Matt Phillips. He asks, do you think that over time, some goods can or should move up the ladder of subsidiary from the responsibility of the locality to the responsibility of the government? So, for example, healthcare or education.
Well, I think the answer to that is no, but with some nuances and perhaps caveats.
Mm-hmm.
I still think issues such as education and health and welfare, health, education, and welfare, are fundamentally and primarily the province of civil society, beginning with the family. It's always been the case that the role of the state is merely to assist in a subsidiary role, the family, and the institutions of civil society. I never want that to change. I think primary responsibility should always be with the family. So I don't want the state dictating that everybody's got to have the state-approved education. Right? I think the state can require some things. It can require a certain amount of math. It can require a certain amount of English literature or history. There's some legitimate things that the state can do, but the state shouldn't be saying you got to be in public school. We have to have access to your kids so we can fill their heads full of whatever we want. John Stuart Mill, one of the founding fathers of liberalism, was against that, and he was right to be against that. He was against it for the right reason. You give the state a monopoly on the public schools, they will definitely use it for indoctrination. They don't want the little heads to be filled with exactly what is in the interest of the state from the point of view of the people who control the levers of power. I don't want the state requiring everybody to be in public school. I don't want the state requiring everybody to be in school as opposed to being homeschooled. I think they can demand education. That's legitimate. That's for the common good. They're playing their proper role there. But it's got to be, in the end, up to parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children, including, most critically, the moral content of that education. Same with health. We can have more or less government involvement in the system. There's a range there. I wouldn't want a socialized system like the national healthcare system in Britain, under which I lived for 5 years. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. A lot of Brits like it, but boy, I didn't. I can tell you some horror stories about that. Fortunately, not about me personally, but people I knew who were in the system. So, but there's room for more or less government involvement. We can debate that, and there are good reasons for debating, and there are incommensurable values that are at stake in some of those debates. But fundamental healthcare decisions should be made by families and physicians, not by bureaucrats. That's the key point. So it's here parallel with education. The fundamental decision-making, so the question of who has the primary role, has got to be with families and civil society, not with the state, not with the bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I should add one other dimension to this. So go beyond health and education. Technological changes, geopolitical developments, catastrophes can always affect whether this or that particular matter is best handled by civil society or by government, or best handled at this level of government, low level of government, as opposed to higher levels of government. And there's no embarrassment in that. Things change. Reality is not always the same. So there's no rigid rule that says every issue has to be handled forever at this level or that level. Developments, changes, catastrophes can alter that.
Mm-hmm.
My worry, though, we have to acknowledge that fact and give it its due in practice as well as theory. My worry, though, is when legitimate reasons for shifting power upward obtain, it seems that when those reasons go away or lessen in their force, we never get a drawback of the authority of the state, of the central state, of central power. It always seems to remain up here where it was. The exception to that rule historically is there have been many times in our history when we have expanded state power to fight a war and then retracted it.
Sure.
We didn't do so well in the Cold War. We expanded national power very significantly, with conservatives buying in because of our legitimate concerns about Soviet imperialism and tyranny. Conservatives bought into the expansion of government as necessitated by the Cold War. But when the Cold War was over, there wasn't any kind of retrocession, movement of power back to the states and to the people. What was centralized remained centralized. And I wish I had a good answer for that.
And is the environment another example of one of these things that, should go up the ladder, do you think?
It could be. It could be anything that affects the Earth as a whole. If we're hit by an asteroid, there are lots of things that could make legitimate a shifting up and down. Now, in every case, it would have to be debated.
Right.
Is there actually a crisis? What's the character of the crisis? Is the best thing to do to allow market forces to deal with the problem, or have government intervention? If so, government at what level? Or should it be some mix of private and government, or free enterprise and government? All those are legitimate differences, and often reasonable people of goodwill will disagree about where to strike the balance, or whether to shift authority out of the private domain and into the public, or vice versa. And this is why we have institutions of Republican democracy, so that we, the people, acting according to constitutional methods, can decide. And we're not going to get it right every time. We're frail and fallen and fallible.
Right.
At least we've got Republican legitimacy when we do it that way. The mistake is to leave everything to so-called experts, sure, or international tribunals or whatever that are supposed to know about these things. Or the long experience of humanity tells us we should defer to experts. We should take into account what experts say. Some experts actually are experts, but even the experts who are experts don't know everything. So, they shouldn't displace Republican decision-making. They should be sources of information, not decision-makers.
Right. Okay, well, we don't have much time left, but several people are asking about court packing. So I'll just ask you quickly, is that something you're worried about if, if the Democrats get, House, Senate, White House?
Well, recent developments probably have reassured them that they really don't need to pack the court. The Republicans do a pretty good job of providing the votes that the Democrats and the progressives need to sustain the precedents that they like, and sometimes even to advance their cause. If you go back all the way into the Reagan years, the appointment of Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy, who turned out to be such a constitutional disaster, David Souter in George H.W. Bush's term. There have been a lot of people who were supposed to be constitutionalist judges who were committed to judicial restraint and to ruling by the law and not by making up or manufacturing new law, who turned out to be just what the liberal doctor ordered or the progressive doctor ordered. So that's probably calmed them down a bit. It was shameful that there was talk of court packing. The Democrats have lived with some shame over that since FDR tried it back in the 1930s. And back then, his own party, or at least some key people in his own party, including some of the judges he had appointed, justices, opposed him because they knew it meant the end of the rule of law. Mm-hmm. Now, with that black mark in the history of the Democratic Party and the progressive movement, it is rather shocking and shameful that they brought it back. That as soon as the court stopped, or they thought stopped, it actually hasn't stopped, it turns out, stopped becoming a mechanism for super legislating results that progressives wanted, they're talking about destroying the rule of law again by the same method, packing the courts. Now, having said, there's no magic number in 9. Constitution doesn't require that there be 9 justices. There could be 128. There could be 3. Mm-hmm. So that's not the problem. Is not the number 9. The problem is you don't alter or shouldn't alter the number of judges in order to get the results that you want. I haven't even been willing to support that. I made a joke or two, but I haven't actually been willing to support it, even when the Republican judges have so often turned out to be not very good at actually following the law. but very good at serving the desires of the progressive wing of the country. The thing to do is reform the court. The court packing is a revolutionary policy. We don't need a revolution. We don't need a revolution in the streets. We don't need a revolution in the courts or in the police. We need reform of these institutions. Reform good, yes, absolutely. Revolution, lawlessness, including in the courts, no.
Right. Okay. Well, on that note, I think we have to wrap up. So, thank you all for coming. If you like Robbie George, I have this book right here. I recommend Conscience and Its Enemies as a good starting place. And you can find that book on isibooks.org. I'm always a company man. And if you like us, if you like ISI webinars, the next one is on July 15th. It's actually a debate between Oren Cass and Victor Klar on nationalist economics, which is a really interesting interconservative topic. Amity Schlaze is after that on August 5th. And then we have Charles Kessler at the end of August. So a lot of great speakers coming up. We really appreciate all your interest. We're sorry we can't get to all your questions. But yeah, thank you for coming. And thank you so much, Dr. George. It was an honor to have you on this.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it very much, Thomas. Best of all my friends at ISI. Proud to be associated with you guys.